The last few weeks we've been in a little series, Nuns, Nuns, and Nuns. First, Nuns was about people who have no religious affiliation and how we interact with them and deal with them and respect where they're at in their life. Second week was about N-U-N-S, little old ladies in habits and black hats, and who just give their life to service and how we can use them as a model of faith. This week, I tried to sneak it around, but Daniel caught me. He said it's noon last year. Last week he said it's noon, not nun. It's not nun, it's N-U-N, noon. In Hebrew and Aramaic, two languages that Jesus definitely spoke. We don't know if he spoke anymore, but in those two languages, noon is a letter. In Greek, the same letter is nu, without the end of it. In English, that letter is... Yeah, y'all are that's easy. Easy question. Got it. Nowadays, the Arabic language also has the letter noon. It's been in the news lately a lot because one of the words that starts with noon in Arabic is Nazrani. Does anyone know what Nazrani means? It's a little easier than the guesses here. Nazarene. And Jesus the Nazareth. In Arabic, the word for Christians is Nazarene. So you're kind of right, it's Christians. And so over the last few months, if you've been watching any news at all, you've heard about the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and now we're just supposed to call them the Islamic State. But that language doesn't feel right to me because they don't stand for Islam one bit at all. Before we get into what God might say to us, I just want to, through all of this situation, I just want to get this record straight, that the Quran couldn't be any clearer about how Muslims should treat people of the book. That's the phrase, people of the book. That means Jews and Christians and other types of Muslims, Nazarenes like us. But despite this abundant message in there for peaceful cohabitation, ISIS completely misuses religion and try to co-opt the passion and faith, usually of young, angry, bored men, and then they use that in their own aims. Far more than Muslim, they're just another terrorist organization with dreams of political power. And in that pursuit, principles of Islam, just a nuisance. Does anyone know what that word means?
Submission.
Yeah, eventually, that's really the depth of it. The simplest meaning is peace. Submission's like the deep meaning that if you were Muslim, you would hold on to that sense. So the simplest, peace, shalom, the word shalom. Notice the letters kind of line up, just different vowels thrown in there. And if you were a Muslim, same letters, S-L-M, the M-U in Arabic is the same as the English E-R at the end of a word. So a Muslim is a peacer, or someone who submits to peace. Someone who submits to God's will of peace. That's the fullest kind of sense of it. And is ISIS submitting to God's will for peace? Of course not. They have taken over a portion of land in a few different areas and countries and tribal regions. It's about right now half the size of Colorado. Just to give you a sense of where that is there. And they have outlawed all other faith traditions, even other versions of Islam. They have been demanding conversions or else death. And plenty of people who have not sworn allegiance to their violent sense of the world, they've been executed. If this is a global threat or not, I don't know. If we're supposed to go to war as America, I don't know. I don't have enough information. I don't know how our leaders are supposed to respond. I just don't have enough to have an informed opinion. You probably don't either. And so we're going to leave all those questions over there. What I'm more concerned about is what happens when ISIS takes over a town. When they come into a town, I don't really know what they do to stigmatize and persecute the Yazidis and the Shia and all the other people in town. But when they find a Christian, they come to that person's door and they paint a noon on their door. Nazarene here, you have no control over your life. You have no value. You have no point of existing. We might kill you today, or we might just make your life a living hell until we do. And some churches, thank God, are speaking out, but I don't think they're speaking out loudly enough. There was a campaign, perhaps you saw it on Facebook, a campaign to raise awareness by having people change their profile pictures to the Arabic letter of Nun. Did anyone see one of those? The front row here, 4 people saw that. Well, it was a good idea. This is what hashtag activism is all about, is to stand in solidarity with people from afar when you can't go and stand with them right there. But then at the same time that happened, somebody dumped a bucket of ice water on their head, and then someone else dumped. How many people saw the ALS challenge with a bucket of ice water on someone's head? Yeah, it took over. It took over at the same time. And so it was a worthy cause, but what that's done is it's taken this ISIS and the persecution of Christians, well, it's turned it into a political ping pong ball instead of a social activist issue. There were a half a dozen articles this morning in the Washington Post. I read on this here phone. But the loudest thing, other than those articles, the loudest thing that I've seen about ISIS and the Christians who are persecuted is the guy from Duck Dynasty. Big beard, you know. He had the creative idea. I mean, he's really creative. This guy's he's smart up here. He says, what we should do is we should make them ISIS fighters. We should make them become Christians, or else we should bomb them to smithereens. Convert them or kill them. Big beard, you know. What if you change that camo head thing into like a desert chic, and instead of a duck call, you just turn it into a Muslim prayer thing? He looks a lot like other people we've seen on the news when he sounds like that. We've seen this attitude before. About 60 years ago, some of you were there and saw it all. It started with sort of religious ideas and mixed in some radical thoughts about industrialization and a hunger for power, and put on top there a desperate belief in that some people are just worthless. And the symbols of persecution then, not a letter. What they did is they sewed a little star on your clothes. Jew here, we want you to know you matter less than everybody else. We'll start taking some of your rights. We'll start with that. Then we're going to convince everyone else that there's something really wrong with you. And then we'll probably kill you. And if we don't today, we'll make your life a living hell. And churches did speak out, just not as loudly as they could have. Some Christians, you might have heard this story, tried to arrange a plot to assassinate Hitler. They weren't trying to be heroes. These young men were, they felt shame about what they were doing, but they just felt like they had to do it. Other Christians courageously wrote statements that are still in our church's history books, and we use them in worship sometimes. Some Christians came to America to spread the news of what's going on over there. Some even went to concentration camps and died right alongside their Jewish neighbors. But what if? I wasn't there. I don't want to blame anybody. But what if the churches would have spoken out more loudly? Some preachers would have lost their jobs because, that happens when they tend to get a little political. But is it crazy to think that a stronger religious response back in the 30s and the 40s might have stopped a little bit of the Holocaust? Even a little? Is it a fairy tale to imagine that when people stand up for what is right, maybe our country wouldn't have had to send hundreds of thousands of people and lost so many men in service? In America, of course, if you go back 150, 160 years, no one needed to write a noon. No one needed to sew a star. The symbol was your skin color. Black person here, actually, you're not even a person. Sure, you want rights, but not going to happen. We probably won't kill you because you're really valuable, but we're going to make your life a living hell. And in those days, many Christians were speaking out and speaking out loudly, and they did make a difference. Quakers, especially, forced people's consciences. And all across the Mason-Dixon line, Christians secretly were helping slaves sneak into the north to escape for freedom. There was no social media at the time, so the way that people talked about this was to come to church. And it was in church that people had to think about justice in those days, and it did make a difference, just not enough of a difference. Because some people in those churches, they had a little bit of bad religion mixed up with a little fear, mixed up with a little thirst for power, an addiction to economic growth, and this sad, sad notion that some people were just inherently worthless. Am I nuts to think that maybe if churches did more in those days, that maybe the Civil War wouldn't have been as bloody? Am I just a Pollyanna to think that the power of the Holy Spirit working through good people might have found a way to make peace and stop, or at least slow, that oppression? It's a good thing we don't have any injustice in our country these days. It's a good thing that people of faith are never called on to speak about anything controversial. It's a good thing the church never has to get mixed up in political issues. That would be dangerous. And it's a good thing that we can just worship right here for 1 hour and ignore everything outside the doors, because actually dealing with the problems out there, it's just too big, and what are 60 people going to ever do? Frankly, to continue this note of sarcasm, we can't really do anything, you simple 60 people. Nothing important, at least. We can pray. We can pray. But we can't really protect young girls from a world that marginalizes them as sex objects. We can subscribe to newsletters and that kind of thing, but we can't affect the global dynamics of immigration. We can support this awesome youth group. We can send them in places. We can give them great experiences. But we can't make the world a safer place for all kids. We can recycle some stuff. You can recycle your bulletin. But we can't stop global climate change. We can make a sandwich. Thank God we can make a sandwich in the summertime. But does anyone believe that this little church can do anything to stop poverty, homelessness, and all that comes with that? We can preach about ISIS, but we can't sway the decisions of the people who matter. Poor little church. We had a lot of power back in the day. People listened to us in the 1950s. Remember that? Mayors came to ask what pastors thought. Presidents would consult Billy Graham. Churches determined what the moral crises of the day were. They didn't respond. They decided, this is the moral crisis. We will handle this. And now, if John Stewart and Bill O'Reilly don't argue about it, nothing's going to get done. Poor little church. We know about oppression all around us, but we're just too weak, and oppression is just too strong. What would we even say without alienating half the members on this side or half the members on that side? Who would come to our support if we couldn't fix everything in one easy miracle? But Dennis, poor little Moses. Moses was out herding the sheep. You know what that means? You have a subtle clue in there? Back in the days when people herded sheep in the fields, you were a sheep herder until about 12 or 14. Once you started growing into a man, you got some other jobs closer to home, right? And then when you became a man, it was your job to breed the sheep and sell the sheep and bring them into town. But people who watched the sheep in the fields in the wilderness, all of them under 14. Think about that in Christmas time when it talks about the angels coming to the shepherds, coming to boys out in the fields. So Moses is out in the fields watching sheep. He's an old guy doing a boy's job. Moses has a paper route. Moses is just this useless old guy. He has to rely on his father-in-law, for gosh sake. He can't get a real job to support his family. One, because he's a foreign immigrant. No one's going to give him a job for that. Two, he has a speech impediment, so he can't get any real job there. So they're never going to send him into town to sell his sheep because he can't say anything with it. Three, he was a felon. He was a murderer. Not that he was all that evil. He just has a bad temper. We're going to find that again later with the 10 Commandments. He takes those 10 Commandments first time down. What does he do with them? Smashes them. He's so angry, he just smashes stuff. And we can psychoanalyze Moses all we want. Probably he's got all these issues because he never met his birth father, and his stepmom just gave him to a nanny to raise. And this guy is incapable of accomplishing anything on his own. In fact, if there was anyone in the world at this time who was less qualified to stand up to strong powers and to lead a movement against persecution, I don't know. You point to him. Someone less qualified than Moses. Be hard to find. Moses was probably the only fully grown man in the whole area who worked in those fields. He was probably the only full-grown man who would go out and camp for weeks at a time, and he knew where water was, and he knew where shelter was, and he knew how to survive in those hills. The only person my age who could do that. Everyone else did it when they're kids. They're done. They don't remember it. They don't know the hills anymore. And Moses had this brother, great speaker, just fantastic. Moses had the ideas. He could stumble around and talk with his brother, and then Aaron could turn them into poetry. And some people remembered this time. They heard a story about when Moses was younger, and he stood up for justice, and he risked his life, and he sacrificed all of his comfort and everything he knew, all to resist persecution for someone who couldn't resist it on their own. But most importantly, if any of us were going to go confront the Egyptian government, you got to know your way around the palace. You have to know who to talk to. You have to know how to conduct yourself, what to expect, when to ask for something, when not to ask for something. Moses was the only Hebrew in the world who could even get a meeting with Pharaoh, because he was his grandpa, And he was the only Hebrew in the whole world who could lead them through the desert. So if there's anyone in the entire universe then who was more qualified to lead a movement against persecution, you point to him. Because Moses was perfect. And friends, there is a call to us. God has called, and we are Moses. Our world is so full of every kind of need imaginable. There is violent persecution in the world. There is subtle injustice in our neighborhoods. The task is immeasurable. It's true, the church, Big C church, not just this one, but the Big C church, underfunded, underqualified, probably not good enough, not smart enough, not stable enough to really accomplish anything. But God called us. And God walks with us. The church isn't as powerful as it used to be, but that just means that over the last 50 years, we've had to cultivate relationships with other groups. The church is used to talking way too much, like some pastors, so maybe it's best if we just have a heavy tongue, slow of speech, get things done. We know what oppression looks like because it has stained our own souls, and we know what freedom from persecution looks like, because that is the story of God. We have been called, and friends, we are Moses. What's our answer? Here I am. Here we are.